Hello and welcome to another episode of the Six Five Webcast. I'm your host, Steven Dickens, and I'm joined today by Spurthi from IBM. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephen.
So let's dive straight in. Tell the listeners and viewers a little bit about what you do for IBM, and then we'll use that as a jumping off point.
Definitely. I currently work as a product manager on Data Product Hub, and I'm really excited to kind of just talk about that because it's this new offering that we've come up with that ties into our data fabric portfolio within IBM Data and AI. And it's really all about just data products and what we can do with it. So, we're very excited about that.
So we've been tracking this space for a while. Obviously, you guys made the acquisition of Databand. That's kind of
Yes.
coming through. So really, obviously, IBM's been in this space for a long time. You guys have been in the data space probably as long as there's been a data space. So why is that data? Let's start to unpack that a little. We're starting to see about data sharing. We're starting to see the whole sort of data stack start to get reimagined. I'm seeing a
Yes.
lot of AI applications come through. That's kind of top of the stack for me. But that
Yes.
whole piece kind of below that, I see there's a whole sort of inflection point. What are you seeing, and why is that sort of moving of data around and that sharing of data becoming so critical?
100%. First and foremost, I think basically what you said really just applies. Number one, data at this point sits everywhere. You
Hmm.
could be new to data and new to like data governance, or you could be in a place where you've made significant investments in terms of data fabric and information architecture, or you could be anywhere between the spectrum, and you will still see that data will sit everywhere within your organization. So now, say for instance, if I'm a non-data user, I'm somebody who's really new to consuming and making use of this data. How do I go about finding where data is? Number one. Number two, if I do so happen to get my hands onto this data, which by the way, from a manual process point, takes anywhere between I want to say like a couple of days to weeks, depending on how your organization's structured. But if I do happen to get my hands onto this data, how do I know how to use it? How do I know if it's good to use? And how do I know when will it expire? So there's even if I do happen to get my hands on data, there's still so many open-ended questions, and this particular problem will only go to expand itself as an organization scales and acquires more things into their infrastructure, has more personas to deal with. This problem just keeps getting magnified. So, how do you make that particular data sharing procedure more streamlined and more effective so that way when you scale, your data sharing also scales with you and puts you in a position where you can truly be a data driven organization. So that brings us to the main point of being data sharing focused in terms of the
Hmm.
product.
So, I mean, it's interesting for me. We're seeing that data everywhere. I think hybrid's one as the deployment
Yes.
model of choice. If you wind back maybe 10 years, it was cloud first. We're now
Yeah.
seeing people with data in the cloud. We're seeing that with data on prem. We're seeing that with data in every combination in between. We're seeing legacy tech stacks. We're seeing new tech stacks emerging. We're seeing AI drive through all of that. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing? I mean, you're chatting to clients all the time. What are those pain points?
Okay, so first and foremost, I think, what we just talked about in terms of getting hands onto the right data at the right time, that definitely still applies. But what happens if I do happen to get my hands onto the right data? Now, let's get into the shoes of somebody who is an analyst at a government agency. Um, if I have access to data and somebody else is requesting it, simply emailing it to them might not be appropriate. Maybe this person should not have had access to this data in the first place. So again, in terms of keeping a version control, or even for that matter, an audit trail of how data is being shared across the organization is super, super crucial, especially if you're in areas where data management is more federated or restricted in nature. So that's one. Number two, if from an organization perspective, let's go a little bit more on a high level. When we think about data sharing, how do I, as an organization, know how data is being consumed within, my entire firm? Who is driving most of the data usages? which department uses data the most. Even for that matter, when does data usage spike within my organization? These are questions that are super crucial, especially when you start navigating and becoming a little bit more data mature and implementing these high scale AI initiatives within your organization. So with that being said, having that lens of visibility of how data is being consumed within the organization is super super crucial. And naturally with that comes the fitting of or the need of governance, and establishing governance when you're sharing data, establishing governance on using data, really just having an end-to-end perspective where data is being used, shared, and managed with a governance structure that kind of ties everything together.
I mean, I think the couple of things that stood out for me there, you talked about governance, whether that's for a regulatory perspective, whether that's just governance, good housekeeping. And the other piece was for me kind of how those organizations can look at the provenance of that data. Where did it come from? Can I check where it came from, whether it was from external, whether it was from internal? Which department did it come from? How did it, can I trust this data point and know where it's come from within my organization? But that kind of leads me to the next question, which is one of the big barriers to this is data quality,
Yes.
duplication, inconsistency. Regardless of whether you've got that provenance controls and the governance controls, you've got to be able to just check the basics and that hygiene of the data. What are you seeing there?
So that is actually fantastic. So when we think of data consumption within the organization, it typically comes down to how good is this data to be used. Now, to kind of simplify this entire concept, think about how we consume products from a grocery store. Typically, if I'm buying milk, when I pick it up, I take a look at how long the expiry for the milk is, if it's packaged well, and that's when I go ahead and consume it. The same thing really just comes down to data as
Mhm.
well. Your data needs to be in a position where it can be consumed, where the quality of the data is good, and if you have any questions about the data, it needs to be, you need to be in a position to be able to answer them as well. And that's really the point where data products really come in. Because what we're doing is really transitioning away from how data is being managed at a project level, in a typical ad hoc type basis or a manual type basis, to more of a commodified and operationalized perspective on data through data products. This is really a method of packaging data and data driven assets into one particular product that is curated towards your specific business need or domain. Um, and it's infused with things like lifecycle management, right from its conception to the retirement of it. On top of that, there's an SLA, SLO, or data contract structure in place that really kind of goes to highlight if the data that you're using is restricted, or does it have certain policies or governance in place? Does it need to abide by certain regulations? Can it be used for AI/ML? How is it how is the auditability in terms of the data as well? So a data product brings all of this together and really operationalizes the data. So that way, when you pick this data up for usage going forward, you don't have to worry about things like quality. Because again, when you consume a product in the first place, be it data or, something like milk from a grocery store, you're assured with the idea that what you're consuming is of good quality. And the same thing applies and should apply to data, which is where data products come in.
I love that analogy. We hear data is the new oil, data is the new gold.
Yes.
I've not heard data is the new milk. So I love that analogy. I mean, I think data spoils. Trying to be able, you mentioned the sell by date. What's the shelf life of this data? But the thing that came across from me there in that analogy is kind of data as a product. I hadn't thought of that before. So the ability to sort of package it up, check the packaging of it, and then being able
Yes.
to deliver that, through a supply chain. I'm sort of thinking of that analogy of how that sort of carton of milk gets transported around a supermarket.
Yes,
That
exactly.
exact sort of same amount, sort of thinking about how that data gets productized, packaged up. You can check the governance of it. Where did the milk come from? be able to move it through the process, be able to check the timeliness of that data. That's a really powerful analogy in my mind.
No, 100%. I mean, really, when it comes down to how organizations are consuming data, it's such big volumes and such big need as well. So if these two are scaling so quickly, you need to pivot to a method of using, managing, and sharing data that also can scale to that particular need. And at the same time, it needs to, and this is something that we talk about quite often, which is really at this point, a lot of the organizations understand that. They understand that, hey, we need to kind of make investments and ramp up on how data needs to be shared and governed across. But at the same time, for a user, that would mean toggling through 15 different places to find what they need, which again, in terms of time savings, in terms of the cost of just acquiring this data is so high because you're toggling through 15 different applications, talking to 3 4 people, escalating things, and then eventually getting access to data. This is where again Data Product Hub, what it does is just sits on top of this existing architecture that you already have and connects to all the different layers. So we essentially become this living room where you can just come in, grab what you need, and go without having to, again, interact with 15 different individuals and applications and depend on manual items to get what you need. You simply have this one stop shop, um, almost like an e-commerce type website that can come, give you what you need in terms of your data. If you don't have what you need, just have a method to just request it and have it delivered to you. Think of how we kind of consume things along the lines of ordering on Amazon. Within a click of 3 buttons, you have what you need. Shouldn't getting access to data be that simple as well?
It's interesting in the pre-read for this and the material that you guys sent over in our pre-discussion. We talked about this concept of a data marketplace.
Yes.
I think that's fascinating. I'm going to keep with the milk analogy because you've got that stuck in my brain now. You've landed that one. You know, how does that packaged data product get consumed by the business, and how does it get sort of transported? And I love the concept of that marketplace, and then being able to but something else you mentioned, and we're sort of 14, 15 minutes in, is the cost of managing this data. you
Hmm.
mentioned you mentioned it there and you blew past it, and I'm going to drag you back to it. What's the implications there? We're seeing data, just volumes explode. We're seeing data be everywhere within an organization, both within their 4 walls in their data center and in the cloud, and
Yes.
everywhere in between. We're seeing some of these data warehouse platforms and some of these things be beleaguered by sort of cost overruns,
Yes.
and we're seeing the whole sort of FinOps from a cloud infrastructure perspective come through, but also seeing that come through in the data side. What are you seeing from the cost perspective? You touched on it quickly, but I'd love to take you back there.
100%. So let's do, almost like a day in a life of a data user, right?
Hmm.
So without something along the lines of a data product hub or data as a product plus marketplace type an offering, without that being present in the organization, if I'm a finance user, somebody who is comfortable with data but not really in the position to produce data by themselves, if I have to, for instance, find the network spend of all the buildings that my organization owns, I would probably have to first and foremost try and query that myself. Now, if I don't happen to get that, and if I don't happen to query that myself, I would probably go and talk to somebody from the producer standpoint and say, hey, can you send this over to me? Now, the wait time between you asking that and you getting that delivered in itself can be, as I said, weeks, if not days. So if you just kind of, translate that into cost, that's easily, lots of money just being spent on you sitting just waiting for that data to come in. So that's
Is that
one.
is that a sort of time to get the value from the data?
Exact. I would say that is time to get the data. Time to value starts from once you get the data. So again, like that's just extending your time overall. Um, but then on the other side, from a producer standpoint, now this producer will probably have, hundreds of requests just sitting on their on their docket. So now how does a producer know which particular request to prioritize first? Would it be
Hmm.
through a first in, first out, last in, first out? Again, these are outdated methods of looking at how we produce and provide data. Shouldn't it be smarter than that? Shouldn't there be a system that tells you, hey, 15 people from your organization have been searching this particular thing. You should probably request or get that look into that particular request first, as opposed to following an old method of managing and getting data sent over. So again, in terms of time wasted in just producing that data, adds up in terms of cost. Now, as a producer, say, I still get the data in and I sent it over to my finance user. Now my finance user opens it, scrolls through and says, "Oh my God, I think this data is a little bit expired or stale. It's not really as lively in the mindset of what I was thinking." But what we don't know is the producer didn't look into one of the areas where data was sitting, like BI. They only looked into the warehouse and the catalog, but this particular information was sitting right there in BI, but there's no way for them to know because there's no visibility. So now
Hmm.
we've missed that big piece of getting that data converted into some level of outcomes or data driven mechanisms. So again, that cost of missed data sits in. So all this packaged together, I mean, think about it. This is just one interaction on a daily basis. Think about the amount of interactions a mid to large scale organization might have. These might be easily in thousands, if not hundreds. So if you just take that cost and multiply it, you have a crazy amount of cost just sitting because your methods of managing, producing, accessing, and sharing data are not as smart as you would think. So again, that really elevates things and escalates them into a position where you don't want to be. Why not look into a more productive and smarter way of managing all this?
I mean, I think all of us have asked for data from somebody else, whether that's a report we need running, whether that's, can you get me some project data? I need this type of data, sales data, forecast data, whatever that data is. We've all been lived in a day in the life of that loop. You go ask a data producer, hey, can you run me this? They come back to you 2 or 3
Exactly.
hours later. Oh, that's not exactly the report I needed. Can you just tune this a little bit and get me something else?
Exactly.
And that's assuming that you've got an efficient organization where everybody's kind of responding to the requests. We've all been, holidays happen, people are out sick,
Exactly.
those, so that you put all the inefficiencies. I think it's really easy to see where the cost comes, but I think we touched on it. For me, the interesting piece is the lack of time to the time to capture the value from the data.
Yes.
So you're not just asking for the data because you want it. You're asking for that data because you want to make a business decision based off that data, whether that's to run a cost saving program, drive revenue, expand into new markets, whatever you need the data for. That's being held up as a decision making process because downstream issues.
Exactly. Exactly. Again, think of the amount of time and money that just sits in this particular decision, but you can't really act on it or even think about it as much because the data that leads to this decision is not either in your hands or appropriate.
Yeah.
Or even if it is, you don't know how to use it, or maybe there might be restrictions to it. So again, all of these come down to how Data Product Hub can like kind of alleviate that particular issue. And I think as you mentioned, we really have two things going in the first place. Number one, it's data as a product concept, which we touched upon, but it's that combined and infused into a data marketplace. So now
Mhm.
you've got two ends of a spectrum, a finance user or an HR user within the organization can jump onto Data Product Hub and look up the data products that they need. If it suits their needs, all they have to do is look into the terms and conditions of use, accept it just like how you would for all the terms and conditions, and then just have it subscribed out. So think of it like how you would get something delivered to your doorstep from Amazon. Just like that, you would have this data delivered to you, be it in the form of, a URL or an Excel, or even for that matter, be it in the form of like a flight service mechanism, which can just simply come into the application that you're using. So now again, in terms of delivery, it's easier. But from a producer standpoint, you now get to see a very smart method of how to access and manage these data requests that come in, along with getting a very clean visibility of how data is being consumed across the organization, who is using what, when, and why, and how often. So again, like in terms of visibility, you get that very, very cleared out. So overall, it's a marketplace with data products in the mind of it, which really would help an organization scale that time to value, and optimize that time to value, in fact. Number two, give you that ability to get that visibility across how data is being consumed in the organization while being assured that governance and enforcement are still at the heart of all of it. So everybody who's using it is using the data properly with no open-ended questions of how things are being transported across the organization in regards to data.
So, Spurti, I mean, I could have this conversation with you for an hour or so, if not longer. But they pay me to be the host and keep things sort of moving along here. Couple of key takeaways from me, but I'm going to ask you the question. This concept of data as a product, you've convinced me that data is the new milk, not the new oil. So I love that. And then this concept of a data marketplace. But what would be your takeaways as people are watching this show? What would be the sort of three quick, punchy topics that you would like people to think about when they think about IBM Data Protect Hub?
Um, First and foremost, data as a product, operationalized method of managing and looking at data. Number one, I think that is right in our name. That is what we stand by. And I think, um, in terms of thought about what Data Product Hub does, data product is right there in the name. So that's number one. Number two is really that governance structure of how
Hmm.
data is being managed and how data is being consumed and shared across. So that's number two. But number three is really governed data sharing. And that is something that, we really think is a very, very key value of what you do with Data Product Hub. You have this method of now sharing data across the organization with the ability to govern that particular sharing mechanism in the first place. Not just governing data, but governing the sharing of data. So now, be it in the sense that you're a federated organization or an organization that is just, slightly getting into the idea of data fabric, whatever it is, you now have a method to manage that sharing, creation, access to data overall, giving you that end-to-end perspective on data management for your organization.
So that's fascinating. Really good three sort of bullet points there to bring us home. What what should people be doing if they want to start their journey, finding out more about Data Protect Hub? Where should they go? What should they read first? What would that sort of, I don't know, call to action be if people are interested, having watched this show?
For sure. I mean, first and foremost, come check us out. There's a website called Data Product Hub. Um, I think that has fantastic information of what the product can do in the first place, along with giving you that ability to see all of this in motion. Because I think what we've talked about right now is great, but the ability to tie what we've talked about to what we can do, I think really elevates that experience. So feel free to check out all the videos that we have. We also have a fantastic white paper that can really stand by in terms of statistics of how, Data Product Hub can help and how data as a product is really just the next wave of data management and how to consume data across the organization. So feel free to check that out. It's also on our website, along with a very quick, almost like a teaser of what Data Product Hub can do. And naturally, if all of this excites you, we'd love to continue this conversation. So feel free to book some time with any of our sales folks. Um, it's again, the availability of it is right on our website too. So really all of this ties into our website. Feel free to come and chat with us more on this. We love talking about this more and more. So feel so our website is right there and then. And yeah, I think that's fantastic.
That sounds like a great place to start. I've got to wrap us up, Spurty. This
Yes.
has been fantastic. As I've dug into this product, more and more fascinating every time I go and sort of peel the next level of the onion.
Yes.
But we've got to make this short and impactful. Thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me as well, Ian.
So you've been watching another episode of the 6 5. Please click and subscribe and do all those things to improve our algorithm and how many people see these shows. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.